Howdy. This lecture is for the course INST 222 from our text Diversity Consciousness, the topic Developing Diversity Consciousness. There are several learning outcomes or understandings that one should walk away with by the time you complete this chapter. At your leisure, please take a look at this list. Let's begin with the definition for diversity consciousness. It is a deliberate awareness and respect of the difference around you. The author tells us that there are many important reasons for developing diversity consciousness. He says that it enhances your diversity skills. And what are these skills? Leadership, being flexible and adaptable, critical thinking, teamwork. These are all forms of diversity skills and the kinds of skills that your future employer will be looking for. He also tells us that diversity consciousness expands your horizons and empowers you because it brings you new knowledge that it will become the core of who you are, and this knowledge is something that you always will be able to tap into and that no one can take away from you. Butcher also tells us that diversity consciousness promotes personal growth and strengthens your social networks. So people will get to know you and you'll get to know other people as well. And so this will broaden and strengthen your social networks. And so it becomes almost reciprocal, if you will. People get to know you as you get to know others, and it expands your network within your profession. The author tries to warn us about this term known as cultural encapsulation. And he says that it is a meaning with a lack of contact with cultures outside of your own, and it can promote insensitivity to cultural differences. And he tells us that it becomes apparent through our socialization. And this is the lifelong process of social interaction that enables us to learn about ourselves and others. We are inclined to make friends with other people who are like us, or at least they share our assumptions. And in many cases, we attend schools and live in neighborhoods that are racially and ethnically segregated. So I want you all to think about this. Take a look at your close circle of friends and think about how diverse they are. And if they're not very diverse, it may be a sign that we have led very culturally encapsulated lives where our place of worship, our schools, our families, our communities, the kind of things we read and listen to in terms of the media have all been similar. And this is not a problem, but it does say that we may be inclined to be more insensitive to others because of this cultural encapsulation. It also means that the media may have had a strong impact on how our world has been shaped as well. And it's important that we obtain a kind of cultural literacy, a skill set that allows us to access, evaluate, and create different forms of media. Well, critique different forms of media. So it's important that we do that because some of us have been inculcated with these messages and we have difficulty separating out the reality from the rhetoric. It's so important to be critics of the media as well, and media literacy can do that. The author tells us that if we are so inclined to become conscious in diversity, that there are these 6 areas of development that we need to pay attention to. So let's review all 6. So the first area of development is examining ourselves and our world. And the author tells us that we need to pay attention to this issue of nature versus nurture. First of all, nature is our sort of biological makeup. We get that from our DNA, from our parents. But he also wants us to be aware of how we are nurtured as well. And these are the messages and the enculturation process that happens from being in the environment with our families and communities. And he says that there are 3 reasons why we lack a sense of interconnectedness. First of all, there are many people who place a value on the individual over the will of the group. And there are lots of sayings in American society where we hear, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, or you are your own worst enemy. And this shows this real high value that Americans place on the focus of the individual. But there are some other cultural groups that value the focus of the group. And you've heard the adage, it takes a village. Well, that's based on this African proverb where the real sort of focus or value is on taking care of each other and not looking out for number one. The author tells us to be aware of this term called enculturation. Now, we shouldn't get it confused with acculturation. Enculturation is the learning of the appropriate behavior of one's own culture. So just as a matter of osmosis, being born in your home, within your community, you're going to learn how things work, the culture of your environment, because you are learning those subtle signs and habits on a daily basis. But your culture that you learn through enculturation almost becomes invisible, much like a fish swimming through water. He's not paying attention to the fact that the water is there, but it sustains the fish. It is his lifeblood. And our culture informs us, and it is one of the mechanisms of our cultural lifeblood as well. We need to be aware of it. The author tells us that one of the things that prevents us from being interconnected is the fact that we don't acknowledge how some groups are marginalized. And this marginalization is a feeling of being an outsider. And it can happen because a lot of groups, if you happen to be in a particular group because of your class or your ethnic background or your disability or religion, many people from these groups do experience marginalization or a lot of bias that comes their way, and we have to acknowledge that. And if you, especially if you're going to be a future teacher, you have to know what your students are going through in their personal and social lives. The author says, why don't we pay attention to a couple of things, the differences and our similarities. So when we approach other cultures, don't sample difference from a distance. He's saying get to know who people really are. Some of us play around with other cultures by going to a different restaurant or going to a play or a movie with characters who may be different from yourself, but that's sampling. And that really isn't getting down into knowing who people are. The author also recommends that we seek to understand how the history, perspectives, and contributions of other cultures are interconnected. And so he asks that we understand how, for example, women have been a part of the American history and not a separate feature. So this idea of having Women's History Month is maybe a good start, but we need to show how these key figures have been truly integrated into American history and not look at it as women history, but women in history. The author says that we need to decrease the social distance that you have, and it keeps you from being connected to other groups who may not look like you or share your perspective. And so just look around that circle of people who you keep around you all the time. Often we find that they act like us, look like us, share our assumptions, share our perspectives. And when that happens, that encapsulation, it creates a social distance with people who are different from us. We also, the author says, need to focus on ordinary people and occurrences. And so what this is saying is that so often we focus on heroes and sheroes, and we fail to look at the ordinary people who have contributed to a lot of great things in our society. For example, when we think of the civil rights movement, we often think of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. But the author is suggesting that maybe we look at ordinary people, people who are part of the Freedom Riders, for example, or who are part of the March on Selma, and their names aren't written anywhere, but these are the ordinary people that have contributed in extraordinary ways. We also need to take a look at where our similarities are, because if we just look at the surface of people, we may not realize that we share a lot of similarities in maybe our political outlook or maybe in our taste in food and music. But so often we let the physical, the outside, the biological prevent us from getting to know people and connecting with them in a meaningful way. The author, in our third idea for developing diversity consciousness, suggests stepping outside of ourselves. And what this means is that we need to have a kind of double consciousness where we not only look at who we are and our perspective and how we feel and our own assumptions, but we take the time to look at an issue, for example, from the perspective of someone who is different from ourselves. And this is a technique that is known as perspective shifting, where you look at an issue not only from your own vantage point, but you're able to look at that issue from the perspective of someone else. The fourth area of development is called gauging the level of the playing field. The playing field is just a metaphor for opportunities in society. But if we are really observant, we notice that there's a lot of social inequality around us. And social inequality is this real sort of chasm that exists, whether we're talking about opportunities related to gender or income or ethnicity. And there are advantages when you look inside of those different dimensions of diversity. The author, for example, talks about social class being one of those forms of social inequality, and he tells us that social class is a category of people who share similar amounts of wealth, power, and prestige. Social class, a dimension of diversity, is not simply a matter of economics. Education, lifestyle, interests, and values relate to one's position as well. And so there are many other examples of social inequality, whether we're talking about sexism or ageism or ableism. There are many examples of social inequality all around us. The author then takes us to this very provocative term known as white privilege. And he defines white privilege by first telling us what unearned privileges are. And he says that unearned privileges are those benefits in life that we have through no effort of our own. Perhaps we were born into a wealthy family, or maybe we have certain benefits in the workplace because of our religious background, gender, or race. And so there are many examples of types of privilege, whether it's your faith, or it's your wealth, or it's your sexuality. Some of us unconsciously benefit from being a part of those groups without ever really realizing it. But when it comes to white privilege, the author is saying that these are invisible privileges that white people may not understand that they necessarily have. And it's not because they're getting something extra, but it's because they don't have to deal with certain things that other ethnic groups may have to deal with. So they have a kind of protection or an immunity to these kinds of isms that can occur in society. For example, number 4, I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. Is that something that a lot of Latinos can say, or African Americans can say? I can turn on the television or open the front page of the paper and see people of my race widely represented. Is that something Native Americans can say? Is that something maybe our Asian brothers and sisters can say? So this list, these are examples of instances that whites can be assured of receiving and not really think about it. It's invisible to them. The author gives us an example about gauging the playing field and asks us to take a look at this question about getting ahead. So 3 groups were asked this question: blacks, whites, and Hispanics. Why can't blacks get ahead? Which of these statements comes closer to your views? And so for a lot of whites, they felt as though that blacks can't get ahead mostly because of they are responsible for their own condition. And so that was 71% who believed that. 15% of whites felt as though blacks can't get ahead because of discrimination. And 8% thought, well, maybe it's neither of those things. But 53% of blacks said they can't get ahead because They are mostly responsible for their own condition, but 30% double said that the reason they can't get ahead is because of racial discrimination. So that tells us a lot about not whether or not one group is correct or not, but it tells us that based on your experiences, you're going to see the world a little bit differently. And if you're constantly being harassed or you're receiving forms of instances in which you think you're being discriminated against, you're more likely to feel that you can't get ahead because of race. As we talk a little bit more about this area of playing the field, the author says that we should ask ourselves this question: are we blaming the individual or society for sexism, classism, racism, if you will, or meritocracy? Because these issues don't just happen on an individual level, they also happen on a societal level. And do we assume that if one person can succeed, anybody can? Well, that's the definition of meritocracy, that the world is fair, that opportunities in life are available to everyone, and all one needs to do is try. Well, that would be great in an ideal world. Unfortunately, we have systems, institutions that are usually headed by people who hold certain biases against certain other people, and it can prevent them from moving ahead. But we can't place all the blame on bias and forms of isms. Often people can hold on to their own stuff and not realize that they are victimizing themselves, and they get in a very deep, dark place where they can't move beyond their own victimization. The author says that we should try to check up on ourselves, that we need to just stop, look at the man, the woman in the mirror, and ask ourselves the tough questions. Are we more comfortable around certain types of people? Is that you? Why is that? Do you make snap judgments about people just from walking by them on campus, or you're a part of certain social networks and not a part of others? There's a reason for that. There are certain messages in our verbal and nonverbal behavior, and we need to pay attention to those issues. The sixth area of development for diversity consciousness is following through. We constantly have to practice good diversity skills and not just have it be a talk, but have it be a part of our walk. You know, I imagine that those young men at Oklahoma State who are part of the SAE fraternity really talked a good game, and would probably say that they're not biased or racist individuals. But it's so important that we do that kind of self-reflection and make sure that our walk aligns with our talk, and that we're not becoming a part of or leading these forms of microaggressions that don't speak well to who we really are. We also need to have a kind of ongoing self-assessment to say to ourselves, am I comfortable around certain people? Why or why not? What is it about me that I need to work on so that I can go into a room and mingle with anybody from anywhere at any time? That really has to be a goal of the working professional in the 21st century. There are strategies for developing diversity consciousness. Take a look at this screen. And number one is to educate yourself. You know, you won't learn about other people until you put yourself in courses, workshop, all different kinds of opportunities. And the last strategy is to never stop learning. There are a range of opportunities, especially around campus at Texas A&M University. You can take courses, you can form study groups, you can find information on the internet, you can travel and do study abroad, you can find a good mentor. These are opportunities that help you through diversity education further develop your diversity consciousness. So someone who is truly conscious of their own diversity has the skills, the knowledge, and the awareness to interact and respect all forms of diversity. We have to remember that this is not something you finish when you graduate from college or you get your degree. It's a lifelong process. So we have to be committed to these goals and learning about others every part of our life cycle. These were our learning outcomes. Pay attention to all of these critical outcomes. Reflect on how well you feel comfortable with each. Thank you for your time, and Gig'em.